This is Pete Oslin here with Bending Rules again, where we talk all things entrepreneurial and entrepreneur stories, essentially. Today, we're going to do a little bit different, though. I mean, we're still going to talk about some stories, but I've got my friend and colleague and just guy I love to kind of talk not just entrepreneurial stuff with, but he was on with us a few weeks back, Chris Capdevila. He was, if you remember, he had invested and started a company while he was still in the professional services industry that initially was ultimately acquired by Oracle. But we talked a lot about his journey there, his transitions, and of course we ran out of time. So this is kind of part two with Chris.
Round two.
Round two because actually he had a lot happen after that too. And so as he and I were talking about just kind of sharing, continue to share his journey as well as mine. There's some parallels here. Is sort of what did life look like after the exit?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, when you go through the process of exiting, there's a lot of excitement. Obviously, you have a material gain. And I realize for a lot of people listening, this seems like a way off type of a thing, but it's something you have to think about as well, right? Because eventually,
you're going to get there, hopefully. Right.
You're going to get there, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things Justin talked about this last week, he had this article, life gets better when you eat what you kill. That was sort of one of his motivating sort of inputs to become an entrepreneur. And so we use that article as a talking point. But one of the aspects of that article was it talked about how you're always planning for your exit. And if you need to be always planning for your exit through relationships, through sort of understanding that. So, assuming you do all the other things right that we talked about in previous podcasts, we'll continue to talk about, you're going to get there hopefully at some point. And today what I want to cover is like, is that enough? And then what happens as you transition out, and in your case, transition back in, right?
Yes.
And
eventually,
eventually it took a while, right? So, maybe you can kind of help walk us through it. Whereas like Justin, last week, he was like, no transition. Like
jumped right into something else.
He was writing down his product ideas as he was still at Lead Method. Lead Method gets acquired. He's got his product ideas that he's sort of building out, and then he starts putting that in motion.
Yeah.
And I asked him, I think Eric asked him, like, why are you here? Like, why you, if you're done, why are you here? He said, well, I'm not done. I need this still. And I still enjoy and I want this. So, now we got you, Chris. You've kind of gone through that process, seen, an end game to it. What happens in the next year, in the next 2 years? Talk about how you thought about getting. I mean, you're always involved in. Talk about your involvement in the entrepreneurial community, all the things that you sort of went through as you transition, and ultimately where you're at today.
Yeah, so that's a big question. We could spend hours on that. I think, just starting off from the event, right, of an exit, and then maybe building from there.
Yeah.
It's without a doubt probably the most emotional roller coaster that I've ever been involved in my life, because you go through all these questions of like, is it the right time? Is it the right acquirer? What am I going to do next, right? What's going to happen to the team? What's going to happen to the customers? And you start, you've spent so much time and energy and blood and sweat in this journey. And now it's sort of like, okay, it's kind of coming to an end and you're handing it off to somebody else. It doesn't always work that way, though. And I think that most entrepreneurs should recognize that the fact in most acquisitions is that the acquirer is likely going to want to keep the entrepreneurs around for a while, right? Just to smooth out that transition.
Yeah.
If it's a good exit for the company, typically the acquirer is going to want them to stay on for a period of time, right?
Yeah, that's true.
And so how do you balance this like massive life-changing event from an economic perspective with now I still need to be like pretty fully engaged, right, in transitioning this and making sure that the baby that you've now gotten to a teenage stage or maybe early adulthood stage is now moving on, and you're still involved but in a very different capacity, right? So I went from founder CEO to like a general manager type of role, but depending on the acquirer, you might not have like true CEO sort of responsibilities, right? Or at least
authority,
authority. Exactly. That's the word I was looking for. And so that transition was really hard. And how do the employees adjust to that, right? And the team members adjust to that. So that was pretty challenging. But I think you need to go into it thinking, okay, I'm going to actually even add exit. And now it's like this massive life-changing event where you've got some liquidity and you hopefully some, financial freedom, and you're thinking, okay, I want to go and buy a new house or some new cars. How do I spend it? Travel. Yeah, exactly. Spend time with more time with family and friends. But at the same time, you've got the acquirers wanting you to stay along to make sure the thing they're acquiring doesn't completely fall apart or more importantly, just gets transitioned well. And so in my case, I had committed through the negotiations in the acquisition process to 6 months as a minimum sort of commitment. And there were some, carrots and sticks involved in that to keep me engaged for a minimum of 6 months. They had started with a much longer period.
Yeah, you negotiated.
And I negotiated sort of more to where I felt comfortable of like, I am able to commit to that and I'm going to give it my all, right? Yeah. And I think that's the right amount. I ended up staying 2 years at Oracle.
Really?
with no like sticks, right, or anything like that. I actually enjoyed it tremendously. The process. We did a couple more acquisitions in the space, and now I was on the other side of it. So I learned a ton as a result of that. Expanded internationally much more than we had. So in Asia, more expansion in Europe. And so I was traveling kind of as the thought leader, kind of the general manager of the business, and really was enjoying it. But at some point, for if you've got that entrepreneurial bug in your core, the big corporate environments, aren't a great environment for
kind of stifle you a little bit.
In
how you wanted to.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, Oracle's got a great type A culture and go-getter type of culture. So in a large extent, it was a good place to be an entrepreneur and continue to innovate and do additional acquisitions in the space and grow the business. So I was having a lot of fun. But then at some point, I was like, okay, I've got financial freedom for the first time in my life.
Yeah, kids are getting older.
Yeah, the kids are getting older. I want to do other stuff, and so eventually your mindset starts to shift from okay, here's this baby. Yeah. Plus, more importantly, I was feeling very, very comfortable with where the team was, how the customers were being handled. I felt like, okay, I can actually walk away and this thing is going to continue to grow and be in a good place. Yeah. So that was important to me because I have that disease of attachment to something that I've built, right?
Man, it's great you were able to accomplish that actually. And that you were encouraged enough to even stay longer.
Yeah, because a lot of times it doesn't go that way, right? It starts to fall apart.
It didn't go that way in my most recent the acquisition of Manzama. And I'm not saying it didn't go that way because anything the acquirer did wrong. And I don't want to really fault them because I feel like, going in eyes wide open, there's just a probability that
there's such hard transitions.
There are hard transitions for your team too.
Definitely.
Right? Because now in our case, they moved us on to, we were on a CRM system, the same CRM, but they wanted us to go to these totally different templates that didn't make sense for our customer base. Now, I know that seems like a minor thing by way of example, but when your processes are working really well, and like you're managing, like say your renewals.
Why change, right?
The why change. And so totally. I had to manage people's emotions around that.
Yeah.
Understanding that why they would be upset for it, but not having the ability to really do much about it.
Totally.
Frankly.
Yeah. Well, we went through that almost exactly because Oracle has this model where they integrate immediately and aggressively. Yeah. They do not allow these silos, right, to exist where you're on your own separate systems. Their model, which, we could have a whole multi-hour long conversation on strategy of acquisitions and transitions, right? Oracle's model was integrate immediately and aggressively. And so we had to shift even the tech stack of our product, right? I mean, was a major, major shift. But for the most part, I think the employees dealt with that. They understood the reasons for it. But yeah, you have to sort of explain the why we're doing this. And maybe some of it doesn't really make a lot of sense, but we still have to do it. So anyways, it was but to your point, most of those transitions don't go well, right? And I call it vision interrupted, right? Acquisitions that interrupt a vision,
I like that.
because
I like that.
So many of those don't work well, and it's a crapshoot. We'll probably get to this, but eventually I ended up joining another company as a CEO, and we didn't have a great transition from an acquisition perspective, right? So I've seen both sides of that, and as an investor, I've seen both sides of that as well. And the majority of the time, they don't work out.
Well, some of it can have to do with where you're at professionally in your career too.
Yeah.
If we sort of look at that standpoint, because when my first company was acquired, I was 28, 29, and bigger company, growing fast, Silicon Valley, super exciting, and lots to learn. Like I felt like I had lots to learn from the.
So you wanted to be involved.
Yeah, I wanted. Right. So can I take another role? Can I grow within that thing? Now, unfortunately, in that scenario, I mean, 2001, 2, then the macro thing changes, and then that company ended up receding a little bit. So but initially it was really exciting, and I think all the employees were really encouraged and things of that nature, and where I was at professionally, I want to grow. Now fast forward later in my life, like the most recent, say, company built and having an acquisition. Well, you don't need that. You don't want that. To take the seat where you're going to put me on a plane internationally,
right?
Or interview for the SVP of product marketing for the whole company.
Totally.
So even though some of these good opportunities actually presented themselves, and that's what I'm saying. It's a two-way street. I credit them, but I think they're dealing with the understanding in some of these cases, like, okay, this person, they've done this a million times too. A lot of these acquired bigger corporate companies, and so like, especially like Oracle, where they're running a playbook, and 15% of the time it's going to be a guy that stays on, 70% of the time it's not, or whatever their numbers.
There's just so many variables involved, right? It's the team transition, and does the leadership stay on, or is there like a rip out, and now you like normally that doesn't work, right? In any company, when you're ripping out leadership like that, there's cultural mismatch, there's investment mismatch, right? All of a sudden they buy it and they're not investing in it as much as they should.
You see a market opportunity
that you can't go after.
Yeah, you got to build a business case. It takes you 6 to 9 months or whatever, and then the window's closed or whatever.
Yeah, but as the entrepreneur and the founder, right, you can't allow that to get inside of you, because there's so many things that are outside of your control at that point, right? And you've gone through the journey where you had a lot more control and a lot more hands-on in terms of ensuring that success.
Right.
And then once you have an exit, and now a much larger company starts to take over, right? There's only so much that you can do. And so your mindset has to change, and your expectations have to change, right?
Yeah, and you kind of rationalize that point too, pre being sold. That you
definitely that's going to come.
Yeah, know that's going to come, but we still have our own aspirations in some way. And when those aspirations aren't met, I mean, it still comes with some level of disappointment. I mean, I did have some aspects of that once we were acquired, like, oh man, we could have just done this.
Totally.
But at the same time, very accepting of the scenario, and understanding also that just for even our employees, like, 10 years at one spot is a long time.
Yeah.
And, in some ways it was good for them to move on and grow and be challenged in different ways too. Not to say they didn't love working at Manzama, and I hope they did, the majority of them, but, they could have stayed on there for another 10 potentially. And that'd have been great too. But I knew from my journey, like, hey, I'm at the end of the journey, and
need to move on.
And if the journey fits, like in your case, it could have fit for 2 years. I mean, we had a 2-year, what do you call it? Holdback or whatever. The same thing, within the structure, we ended up
earn out, basically.
Earn out. That's what word I was looking for.
Yeah.
We still end up getting out in a year, and they accelerate our second year, all this kind of stuff, so I won't go in the minutia, but I mean, I could rationalize 2 years, but it would be a lot different. And I knew that. And so did you. So you you get through that, and that's one aspect of a entrepreneur's life after the exit, which is kind of
well. We could have a whole session on advice to entrepreneurs on how to negotiate, right? Cash only. Be very, very careful with equity deals, right? Because I've seen many entrepreneurs get burned where it looks like they're having an amazing exit, and they take it mostly in equity in the new company acquiring. And then that stock tanks, right? And now you've lost all of your equity value, and you basically sold your company for nothing.
No, you're right. We could have a session on it, because
there's so much.
One of the 2-3 options presented to us as we were sort of in that competitive landscape was exactly like that, and they were like, well, you could roll 50% of your equity into this. I'm like, no, we want.
Now you've given up control.
We want 80. So we went far with that one. There was an LOI in front for that particular possibility too, but it was 80% cash, 20% roll forward, and 50 million on the balance sheet to go acquire other companies and invest. And so that was kind of a combined roll they're going to do, which sounded pretty exciting. And yet at the same time, even with all those things, like even if they put it on your balance sheet, are you really going to use it? Are they really going to be available? But I was willing, if you're as good as your options, we had a better option, so we did that. But that was a serious consideration, and I would have been willing to roll like 20%, maybe 10%.
But some of them do 100% equity, right? And it's like, oh my God, you've lost control, and now you're putting all your eggs into an equity that you don't really control, right? And I've seen so many, from a market timing perspective, so many entrepreneurs just kind of lose all the equity value that they.
It'd be really interesting to have a story on here where that's worked out.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I would love to talk to an entrepreneur that built something, who's ever out there listening, and you rolled in equity and it worked out, and it actually ended up being a meaningful result.
Early sales to a Google or a Facebook or an Apple.
We know they're out there.
They're out there for sure.
But I wonder, I'm going with how
percentages.
Usually it's not going to. I'm talking about selling a company you may have never heard of.
Right.
And maybe
and did that work out?
And did that work out? Like
totally.
If Google had come and knocking, I may have considered that a little bit more, but we weren't a big enough market for Google. But you know what I mean? Like, I could. But even with you, like, one could argue Oracle, that could have made sense, but you're like, no.
But even in that case, Oracle stock through the decades, kind of ebbs and flows, right? And so, it's just risky. But anyways, we're digressing into it.
If you have a good board and advisors,
they'll help you through that.
Help you manage through that.
But then at the same time, they, if you have investors that are vested in the business and they're shareholders, right? Because the board's supposed to represent the shareholders, but if they only have a little minute stake, they're not going to really care too much about that decision point, right? Where if you have 70% of the equity, you care what composition you get, how much of that is cash versus equity.
Absolutely.
And how much gets held back in escrow and how much of it is an earnout, right? So there's tons of things to discuss in that regard.
Yeah. And I guess the the takeaways on this is that everything is negotiable. Like, it's never
totally,
someone may present something like, hey, the only way this deal gets done is 80% equity rollover, but that's usually not just the case, right? If you have other options and you can.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to the fundamental advice of like, exits are the best when you don't need to exit, right? Once you need an exit, that's when all leverage goes out the door, right? And so if you can focus on the important things of just being amazing to your customers, right? And growing revenue and having options, to your point, then you're going to be able to negotiate. If you don't have any options and you have to find an exit, then, acquirers are way smarter than you.
Yeah.
And they will smell that out and they will have complete leverage over you.
And they do this all the time.
They do it all the time.
Yeah.
Where you're kind of coming into it fairly fresh, depends on how sophisticated your board is, and you might have advisors, whether it's a banker or attorneys, but still, their motivation is to get a deal done. And not necessarily to maximize, value to the shareholders.
Yeah. Before we kind of transition off life after the exit, moving past the exit, now Oracle, just one more question. Was your dynamic a competitive dynamic? Like
It was.
I can't remember if we talked about that last time, because I think that's obviously another important point.
Yeah.
So there's the sense of urgency increases and everything of that nature.
Yeah, it was. I mean, we were approached, and it was the second time around. And when that happened, we weren't in the market actively. We hadn't hired a banker, right? And so when that happened, we actually knew what other acquirers might be in play for the business. And so we immediately reached out, the board reached out, we hired a banker, and ended up getting pretty quickly, another one or two offers.
Yeah, you ran a process, got it done, especially when you have a validating first offer or interest from a legitimate company.
That definitely gets wheels moving very quickly in other companies, right?
Yeah.
Once you have that to use as a leverage, it can play really well, right?
I mean, for another topic, when you and I chat down the road, like the whole investment banker, when to use and how to use, like I think that's another
huge topic.
It's another huge topic, right? Because again, in my experience, I've had them in some incarnations, not in others, in one process, but then not in another. And I mean, it's just, and the trade-offs were pretty significant in terms of the representation and actually what was attainable. And I think there's a methodology that can work, but it's fraught with some risks. Let's put it that
Definitely.
way. And time suck, and are you really getting their attention depending upon who you look to?
And the disadvantage that the first time entrepreneur has is that they're going through it. They've dedicated their life, right, and tons of blood and sweat and sacrifice, right, to get to this point. And you're at a disadvantage because you've never done this before, right? And the people that you're negotiating with do it all the time, right?
Yeah.
They're pros at it. And so how do you surround yourself with people that have your back, have the right motivation? They're aligned, right, from a motivation and incentive perspective as much as you possibly can to yourself. And that's hard.
It is hard.
Hard to do.
Yeah. No, it is hard. And in fact, one of the earlier in the cycle when we were approached, I don't feel like I had that alignment with the board and maybe even the investors. And, I think they were happy to defer to our direction, Mark and I's direction. But it was only until later when we did like a second round that, the gentleman that was on our board at that time was just phenomenal, a guy that we both know in town, and just provided and has PE experience and had done a lot of transactions and just
super valuable to you guys.
And it was like in my mind, he was as good as any investment banker that I could.
Sure.
So again, a topic we can digress on later, but okay. So now I want to fast forward. We're post exit. You're 2 years now. You're out. Okay, then you leave. Oh, I close the door. At some point, the door closes. I'm done. I mean,
super emotional moment for sure. And that's why I use the roller coaster, right, term, because it truly was an emotional roller coaster. I mean, I think I cried. Well, when we sold, I was so happy, but then I also cried. When we sold
happy
the business,
and
exhausted. I mean, just
due diligence, the rest of it.
Every emotion you can imagine, right, all at once. And so, I ended up leaving, and the business continued to do super well. Some of the team is still there, even more than a decade after, and they've got amazing roles at Oracle.
That's great.
So super proud of that, and super happy and excited for all parties in that regard. But it was time for me to move on, and I ended up deciding at that time that we were finally going to focus on our life, right, and our lifestyle and our life model. My kids were getting into late stage elementary school at the time, and so we had some decisions to make as a family and now we had freedom, right, and flexibility to figure out all kinds of options that we could execute on. And so we decided to change where we were living and change the lifestyle that we had. So we bought a horse ranch in Central Oregon. That's what brought us to Bend, and invested heavily in that ranch, and
some of which we're seeing the background today.
We're actually here.
The traveling podcast.
Exactly.
It's the Chris, mobile. I'm testing the theory. Can I go to people's homes and do the podcast from there instead? Make it a little more convenient. So thanks for having me in.
Yeah,
Chris.
no,
And
our pleasure.
you've been really supportive in this capacity. But so you check the lifestyle box.
Yeah.
Okay, you're present in your kid's life, and
Yes.
this is around the time I'm meeting you, and I'm going pretty hard. You know, you're starting. I see you're starting a little impatient with
Definitely.
now you've got that things are happening around you because you know you're a young guy still
Yeah.
even today, and you're pretty. I mean, you're obviously younger then, and so that's also part of it, right? You still have things left to do.
Definitely.
And so,
Definitely.
how did you decide on that next thing to do with your time after you've kind of immersed yourself with family and you got the right balance to that? It sounds like at that particular time.
Yeah, yeah, no, definitely. I mean, you know, when you're still young and energetic and have more to give, right? There's only so much fun that you can have,
Yeah.
and then at the same time, it's like if you have all this free time, what are you going to actually do with it, and who's also available to spend that time with you, right?
Yeah.
Other than your wife and your kids, it's a limited number of people, and are they cool people that you want to hang out with too, right? So then your mind starts thinking,
Not
okay,
like 30 years older than you.
right,
Or something
exactly,
of that nature.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so I definitely went through that, but yeah, I had a lot more to do and a lot more to give, and so like a lot of other entrepreneurs that had some success, you know, I immediately gravitated to how can I be helpful to other entrepreneurs, right? We kind of we have this bond within entrepreneurs, even for entrepreneurs that we don't know at all, right? But it's like I know what you're going through, I know what you're gonna go through, right? And it's this bond of like being in war almost. I can't think of any other analogy, right? I've never been in war, but that's probably similar. You're taking shrapnel from all sides, right? And so what I ended up deciding to do is early days in sort of the boom that we've had here in Bend and Central Oregon, and a lot of entrepreneurs were coming from the Bay Area and other big cities and trying to make a living here and starting a lot of companies, right? You had to kind of be entrepreneurial because there weren't any jobs here. So there was a lot of entrepreneurial energy and still is. And so what we did is got together with a lot of, well, you know, you included a lot of the local entrepreneurs that were in town and had been in town, got together and formed a small fund to kick off an accelerator.
Yeah, and so this is kind of an incubator fund. Like, was the incubator was an idea? I mean, and by the way, I want to jump back to one thing real quick that you said because I think it's a really I'm glad to hear that you acknowledge this, which is helping other entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. I call it the entrepreneurial code.
Yeah.
You know, for any other entrepreneurs that are listening, that's part of what you need to do with your time. Right? Because you and
give back, right?
And you and I got helped along the way by some people.
No
came
question.
in and they got nothing out of it necessarily. Some got something out of it. They were executives or board members or whatever. They had some self interest, if you will, and that's okay. But we also got help from people that didn't need to help us, and and that's why I don't know. I'm not the type to kind of plug this concept of the podcast, but I think I've been really grateful for the entrepreneurs that are willing to spend that time and do that. I call it the entrepreneurial code.
Well, that's exactly what's happening on this podcast, right? Is entrepreneurs sharing their story so that it hopefully helps others, right?
And I appreciate you taking that time because you're not getting anything out of that per se. So, okay, fast forward, Founders Pad, as you were at, which is the name of the incubator, the accelerator. And I'm calling it an incubator, but it was an accelerator. Like, where were the businesses at? How did you define the scope of that? Yeah. You obviously now are intellectually you're back in intellectually, you're being engaged because now you're dealing with a lot of startups. How did that come together and who did you sort of formulate that with? So it was a fund. You raised some money for it, and it was other like-minded.
Yeah, it needed funding, right, to bring it to fruition, and it was a really interesting intellectual journey because at the time, accelerators were starting to come alive, and primarily in major big cities, right? So the Bay Area had accelerators, and as I participated in some of them as an advisor and investor. I learned a lot about what they were doing and their model. And so the thought process was, can we optimize the model so that we are the most helpful and to the entrepreneurs and ensuring that their journeys are successful. And so we really started to think deeply about the model and how to organize the accelerator / incubator, and what were some of the unique aspects of that, right?
Okay.
That we were going to bring forth, all in the spirit of helping the entrepreneur be the most successful they could be. And so a lot of the interesting tweaks that we made, right? Most of the accelerators at that time were focused almost exclusively on what I call putting lipstick on the investor pitch deck, right? And basically getting the entrepreneur really good at pitching their idea or their company to a set of venture capitalists, right? And getting funding. That's almost exclusively what the large majority of the accelerators were doing, and frankly, what a lot of the accelerators are still doing. Right? Because it hasn't really shifted a ton. And so our model was very different of like, okay, well, we're going to focus on that if that's what's important to your business right now. But what we're going to do that's super different is we are going to, if we invest in your company and get you into our program, we are going to put together a team of mentors and advisors that are going to be super relevant to your business. So we really worked hard at finding people that were super relevant to the business.
Okay.
Just based on the business, what kind of business is it, and get those folks immersed in your business in a formal process to go through a lot of the key things as first-time entrepreneurs we either forget or don't know that we should be doing, right? And kind of forcing the entrepreneur into a more rigorous process of company building and startup building.
Interesting,
but leveraging this very relevant and dedicated mentor team, right? And in Bend, we happen to have a very large, I call them exotics, right? Very large group of supply of people that have had success in various different industries. And so it was fairly easy to come up with like rock star mentor teams. Sometimes we had to pull from other cities, right, and other regions, but for the most part, we were able to find really interesting groups of people.
Would you find the company first, and then you find the appropriate skill set to mentor? That was sort of, you didn't already have these people necessarily on the bench, or maybe you'd introduce the concept to them.
Yeah, that was the model. In retrospect, I think it would have been really interesting to kind of flip that model and have some investment thesis, right, based on sort of the volume. Like, for a long time here in Bend, there was a big supply of entrepreneurs that had done the social marketing sort of, SEO, exactly. So there was a big supply of folks with that experience in building interesting companies in that space. And so had we maybe flipped that model and said, okay, we have an investment thesis that those are really good businesses to build, and we're going to actually go look for entrepreneurs that are doing that, unfortunately, they're not going to be in Bend potentially, right?
Well,
and so then that involves.
I was wondering, if you narrow the scope, do you have enough pipeline of entrepreneurs then to address here? So, narrowing the scope is going to help you obviously facilitate your expertise, and it's kind of the skill set being very applicable. Broadening it, now you got to plug different holes. But which I'm curious about, it sounds like the bench was available to kind of fill those holes for the type of companies that you identify with. But you must have still had sort of a criteria, like did it have to be a SaaS company? Did it have to be mobile? Did it have to, was any of that? Or
so the criteria really, frankly, came down to three basic things. One is this an entrepreneur that we think is going to be successful? Do they have the ingredients, right? Are they in it for the right reasons? And that is very difficult to measure. We failed a lot, right? But we really tried hard to try to peel that onion. And that was the most important, frankly, ingredient. The second ingredient was, are they focused on a business or potential pivots of that business that could be an interesting business, right? So we weren't necessarily interested in, businesses that weren't going to have significant scale, right? And I'm not talking about unicorn status, but just the ability to scale it and have it be an interesting business in that regard. And then the third most important ingredient was, can we actually put together a relevant mentor team that will make a fundamental difference in that business? And so if we had those three ingredients, then we made a commitment to that entrepreneur and to their business, right? If we didn't, then it was like, okay, well, should we? Should, there were harder decisions.
There were some that were on the fence, if you will.
That's right.
Of meeting that criteria.
That's right.
I like that you started with the people first on this one, and I want to kind of peel that back a little bit because I think this would be a good takeaway for an entrepreneur. That's even though we're calling this life after the exit, this is for them to have met that criteria. What was it about the person that you were looking for? What sort of characteristics? Because I'm with you. I kind of think that's the number one thing to assess when you're talking to an entrepreneur, and at the same time, it's hard to qualify.
It is. It's super hard. And frankly, I think it would be a really interesting and intellectual exercise to try to come up with some sort of formula or way to systematically go
because
through
like the
that.
other ones like scale, your other criteria, pivot, scale to the market, market.
They're a little easier.
Yeah, number 3, do we have the relevant sort of
that's a lot easier
team I can identify? So the people things become so tough. And
vetting the entrepreneurial or the founding team is super hard. I think that some of the key ingredients that we looked for are some of the same things that we've talked about, right, in our prior conversation of what were some of the key characteristics that sort of put you on a path to potential success, right, and improve your odds. And that frankly comes down to, do they have the grit, the determination, right, and that sort of chip on their shoulder, right, to make something happen, because you're going to be confronted with so many obstacles along the way. Or were they, which we see a lot here in Bend, unfortunately, statistically a lot higher than in a lot of other cities, are they more of a lifestyle entrepreneur that doesn't really want to have a boss, but wants to go to the mountain skiing when the powder's good, right? And are they really into it to build this business, and are they going to sacrifice their life and everything to make this successful?
I wonder if I would have been guilty of the lifestyle entrepreneurs 7 or 8 years in. You could have maybe put me in that category. I'm still growing my thing. Like, I'm still doing. Don't worry about it.
Totally.
But the desperation early on needs to be there, and it's sort of
that drive, right?
It's the drive and everything at all costs type of.
That's right.
I know I need to be. All these things, work-life balance, all the things we talk about are important. But one of the things I learned early in my entrepreneur journey from another entrepreneur, and he just said, you got to look at your life more like it just has these peaks and valleys at times. Like, you can't always ask for work-life balance. There's just going to be, there's going to come some period of your time when you're doing this, you're not going to.
You got to get it when it's there, right?
So I know it's a powder day, and there's 18
That might
inches,
not be the right priority right now.
Don't look at the snow report in the morning. Don't just, you got your thing to do.
Right.
And I think you want to have your cake and eat it too. I get that, but that could come in your journey of building your company. But it's probably going to become year 7 and 8, or sometime later. You've layered in your management team. You identify more. You're growing in different ways. You can kind of be a little bit more hands off. It's still hard. I get it. You're still going to be consumed by it, but early on, finding that temperament, I think
critical.
I think that's good. And I think this is a good thing that an entrepreneur listening to this, or prospective entrepreneur, should take away. So, sorry, but we're not really looking at the lifestyle thing. Chip on. We talked about the chip on the shoulder thing. What's ultimately, you're talking about a lot of things. You're talking about great.
I mean, I could probably
psychological profiles.
You are psychologically profiling people.
I mean, even if it's a great market and a great idea, if you don't see that, you're not interested.
No question. Yeah. Are they resourceful and coachable? Are they going to be a person that is going to build an amazing team around them, or are they the type of person that is really looking to just direct a bunch of people that are no better than them, right? Or are you going to basically surround yourself with a team that's way better than you at certain things and just build an incredible kick-ass team, right? And you can potentially vet that out with people as you talk to them, right? About like, hey, tell me some stories about teams that you've been on and how did that work? What didn't work? And then are they coachable? Are they resourceful and coachable, or are they like so rigid in their mindset that they're just going to continue to pound their head into the wall, right?
With little gain,
right.
Is this, and so
it is a total psychological profiling that you.
Now I'm feeling better about one of my son's majors being psychology.
Yeah, totally.
Because I was like, for a while there, I was like, hey, kid, have you ever listened? And I like that you're majoring in econ too. But now, there is a big aspect of that, not only that translates to dealing with, assessing an entrepreneur, but also translates to how they build a company, deal with customers, how they hire people, how they, motivate their employees and things of that.
I mean, psychoanalyzing, or the ability, the skill set to psychoanalyze people, humans, right? We're so complex.
Yeah.
In all aspects of life, whether it's, the person that's trying to sell you a car, or, your boss that you're trying to negotiate a salary increase.
I realize this is a slight digression.
Yeah, totally.
But it's worth explaining, because I was talking to a friend recently who was interviewing for a large financial services firm. He got pretty far down the path, and it was in a position, I think it was a sales job within that financial firm. Mm-hmm. And he didn't get it after the psych test, or whatever, the profile test that they had to take. So now this helps the firm be objective too, like, so they're not hiring with other aspects in mind, like race or gender or whatever. So it's a tool that I think companies are using more, but it also, I think, has the validity of, like, they just we've seen that this type of
isn't going to work for our culture,
which annoys me, because it kind of puts you in a box,
Yeah.
And I think the entrepreneur skill set needs to be broad. However, I get it. And why I'm spinning this up a little bit is, like, I wonder if you could go back and create some, rigid profile on that, would it have affected, now that you've seen the 10 investments or whatever you made through the Founders Pad, this collection of, I don't know, ultimately I know you ran it for, call it 2 to 5 years, you guys, whoever you're involved in, but my questions around it were, did you find success with that? If so, where? If you had to change things, would have this been one of the areas where you would have tried harder to change things early on, or would have been the narrowing? Or
it's a good question. I think one of the biggest challenges that we had with this endeavor is that we were doing it in a geographically limited area, right? That primarily has attracted people that are in it for the lifestyle, right? And they kind of jumped into entrepreneurship because that's the only way they could generate income, right?
Here in Central Oregon.
Exactly.
Did you think that's still true today?
And I don't want to disrespect folks that are listening here in town, right? Because there's a
lot
ton.
Of them have done build good businesses.
Exactly. Yeah. There's been a ton that have been able to, but it's so hard when you live in a place that offers such an amazing lifestyle, because you already have so many distractions as an entrepreneur, and so many obstacles. To have that obstacle of, like, oh my God, all my friends are going out on an amazing power day, and I'm here, having to prepare for this customer meeting that I have, right? So, like, talk about another hurdle that you've got to get past. That's why I always say, go build a business in, like, a nasty climate, right? That where you don't even want to go outside, and you can really, like, focus on the business, but then you're not going to be happy, right? So you got to have a balance.
Like where it rains all the time, Portland or Seattle. Seattle in particular, a lot of good companies come out there, right?
Totally. And there's a correlation there, I think, right? Definitely.
Yeah, or the amazing sort of facilitation of the Bay Area and the Silicon Valley.
Right, and the network.
And also the culture overall of that.
Exactly. There's a reason why those regions, those areas are so incredible at just pumping out amazing companies, right? Well, and so going back to your question, the challenge that we had is I felt like a really interesting model, right? That we were trying to put together or put forth to helping entrepreneurs be successful. We also had access to amazing mentor teams. We had access to some interesting entrepreneurs as well, but that was the limiting factor. And so we made we basically sacrificed our formula, right, on that most important of pillars.
Interesting.
In order to engage with enough companies.
Because ultimately,
does that make sense?
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, your profile that you really wanted, to the criteria you made that you set out for Founders Pad, some of those standards were loosened. And
that's right.
And when if I fast forward that now, because that's like 2012 or is it right? Am I right in the year? If I fast forward that, is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
12 to 15 or whatever. Like 10 years later, has that gotten better here? if you were to do this again, would it have a different sort of outcome in your mind where you wouldn't have to negotiate as much on that criteria? I just wonder about
It's a great
that.
question. I honestly, I would say the answer is yes, it's gotten better. I mean, this area has grown tremendously,
You
right?
just have more
Pipeline
of entrepreneurs.
more pipeline of entrepreneurs, potentially different caliber of entrepreneurs, and so, but I think just from a volume and supply perspective, just a very different situation now.
So here's my kind of counter to it, because I'm a bit of a living example of the counter, right? Because Manzama started here. But experience outside of this area before, sort of seeing a standard that was set. Lead Method, who we had on last week, started here.
Yeah.
Okay, so somehow we were able to block out those distractions. Okay, but one of the things that I think, to me, moving from LA, now I'd already been in Oregon prior to that for 15 years, so I knew this area, but more recently, right before I moved, was that I knew I could do this. I could execute on a business at less cost. Number one. I also knew I could execute on a business and not have half of my employees be stuck in a commute trying to get into my office forever, right?
Totally.
So I could find, or it didn't take me 2 hours to get to the dentist. I mean, I could be out of a dentist in 45 minutes. So I felt, so from the outside, I know, like, it looks like, okay, people are going to leave at 5:30, and everybody's like, oh, where's everybody going? Because Silicon Valley, you'd be like, where's everybody going? Or anywhere, like, Seattle, right? Well, everything could get taken care of faster. Right. So that was the part that I tried to play with my team, more or less. I didn't. It was hard, to your point, in a lifestyle town, and this translates to your employees too, like, to have them, expect them to be there till 7 or 8.
Right. To have the dedication.
But when you are there,
you're working.
Your productivity is better.
You're happier.
So to
no
me,
question.
To me, I want it. That my counter is, I get what you're saying.
But
can we make that formula work here? Because
you can. But the key ingredient that you missed out on there, that allowed you to be successful and allowed Justin to be successful, is you and the founding team. Right. So that was the first ingredient that I mentioned, right? Yeah. It's had that in you. You had that chip on your shoulder. You were going to be successful no matter where you did it.
Yeah.
Right. Geographically.
But I would be a lot happier doing it here.
No question. And all of those benefits that you just articulated, of happier employees, more dedicated employees, those are very, very strong benefits, but it's got to start with the founders having the right ingredients, right?
Totally. Agree.
Yeah.
The other thing is, Chris, Justin and I talked about this last week. The downside was, it doesn't work. I have to move. I didn't have like,
because there's no jobs.
There's no jobs.
Well, it's either move or just start again, right? And that's fine.
But in Silicon Valley, you could take a little bit of a break. You could take an operational role somewhere. You make a good side, then you start again, like, because there's so many jobs, so many startups. So.
That's why those geographies are just such amazing machines, right? Is because
they can generate a lot of failures before you have a success.
Definitely.
Or a lifetime of hopping around hoping for success, which also happens because it's easier to leave a company.
Definitely.
It was harder to leave a company here.
Definitely.
I think people would stay through a tougher time here because there wasn't
there's not a lot of other options. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
So I like that you did it here, and I feel like you benefited a lot of companies with Founders Pad that you started here, and I don't know if there's anything facilitating Central Oregon the same way. There's a lot of good programs. I get it. The Ben Chamber and Ben Venture Conference, we call it BVC, and others. But it seems like we're now missing that element again, because that is part of the fabric of a lot of places, other regions that we've talked about, right? And your experience. And do you feel like there's room for that again, or? I know not for you per se doing that, but and how would that work?
I think it's a huge asset for any community, right? It's so yes, I think there is room for it here. If you have that sort of infrastructure for entrepreneurs in any geography, there's nothing but positive that comes from that. It's just a matter of who leads it, who brings it forth, and what's the model that's going to make it sustainable. I think in our case, the sustainability issue came down to sort of the funding and the team that we had in place, and the reality that we were investing in companies, and one of the more potential lucrative companies that we had invested in and partnered with required more than just a mentor team, right? There was some leadership that needed to happen at that company, and so I made the decision to. I was also, well, let me just back up. I made the decision to join that company as its interim CEO because there was a challenge that the company was faced with its founding team and the CEO, and it was a company that we felt had a lot of potential, and so I made the decision of jumping in as interim CFO or CEO, sorry, when this happened. And at that time, there was no such thing as an interim CEO. It was like, within 2 days, I had to decide, okay, there's no interim here. It's like, I'm either all in or this thing's getting shut down.
Yeah.
Which would have been super sad. And so I made the decision at that time and spoke to our group of limited partners about that decision. At Founders Pad, the accelerator.
Yeah, that makes sense.
About that tough decision, and they agreed that was the right decision, and so that's what we did. And so when I did that, it was hard to keep both things going. I had to pretty much jump in completely into this. It was kind of a rescue situation. And so the accelerator / incubator journey sort of phased out and fizzled out to a certain extent. And had we kept that going, potentially with the dynamics around a much larger supply of real high quality entrepreneurs here in town, I think it could continue to be a really interesting model of helping entrepreneurs here in our local community. Right?
The other hard part of that, Chris, like keeping it going, is it takes work.
It takes work and funding, right?
It takes work, funding, and like a job. Yeah. And basically, you're working for free to run this.
That's right.
And you're investing in it.
Yeah.
In other cases, like I think these organizations try to hire someone to run that more or less. Like even with Ben Venture Conference or EDCO, raising money for the Ben Venture Conference itself is a time-consuming type of a deal. And so I don't know. I think with that to work, it's almost like you got to build in that who can run that thing. Maybe it is a former entrepreneur too, but they need at some level, because that was a lot. That's a lot to ask on a continued basis.
For sure, especially when there's no economics around it.
Yeah,
right?
And you're waiting for a 10-year horizon for an exit.
Exactly.
So
it requires significant funding. To do it correctly, it requires significant funding and people to be in operating roles, right? And not just as volunteers of free time, right? Yeah. And we kind of ebbed and flowed through that process. Originally, we raised a fund and had some administrative help, right? Because there's a lot to administer, a lot to manage, right? And coordinate and
get everybody in the same room at the same time.
Exactly. It very quickly becomes a fairly complex organization, right? That you're having to manage and dedicate resourcing to. And we had that right out of the gates. That complexity, right, in that element. I would say if that was going to happen again, it needs to be funded with at least a 3 to 5 year horizon, right? And a dedicated team that's going to be compensated, right, to basically have those key roles that keep it going.
Right? Yeah. No, I like that. Okay, but coming out of this, you find a company. It's as you said, it's going to be a bit of a turnaround, rescue kind of thing. But I remember when you were transitioning that you were pretty passionate. Like you found your passion again, because I think I saw you speak at some event, like a fundraising thing. I want to say it was a Broken Top or something. And you were kind of talking about the idea. And I'm like, wow, Chris is really charged up on this. And he's kind of coming in, but he's going into an industry he hasn't per se worked in, and now you're in it. You're rolling up your sleeves. You're back being a founder.
Not a founder, but
not a founder. You're not a founder.
CEO. Yeah, the company was already going.
I kind of had a similar thing way back when I first moved to Bend, and it was pretty hard. It was in the restaurant industry, and I was traveling over the mountain as a PE firm that invested in this company, and it was way more challenging than I thought it was going to be
Mm-hmm.
because, well, it was small, like it was only 3 or 4 people. They
Mm-hmm.
still had a culture, like, and looking back on it, I go back to like, okay, if I had been the founder of this thing, what would these be the people I would have been working with?
Right.
Would have been would have done this with a product, like all those things probably would have been a lot different. But instead, even though it wasn't that far along yet with 3 or 4 people, instead I had a lot of
A lot of anchors.
anchors and
Yeah,
built-in
totally.
assumptions about like how
Totally.
this business was going to grow or whatever. And
Yeah.
so
No, turnarounds are not easy.
I bet you that was tough.
Super tough.
Yeah.
Super tough. But yeah, I was extremely passionate about the business. And it fundamentally came, not to get super personal here, but about a year and a half before I sold my first business, the business to Oracle, I lost my dad to cancer. And that was like a massive shock.
Yeah.
And he struggled with the diagnosis of cancer. Went many years with bouncing from one doctor to another, and so that was my first sort of real life view into healthcare and the state of healthcare and how people get lost in healthcare, and how you can go for years bouncing around from one doctor to another, and you have cancer that's growing in your body, right? And in those years, now you've got a death sentence.
You've lost
Because
that
nobody,
time
yeah,
deal with
you've
it.
lost that time to basically deal with it. And now once you find that right doctor that does the right things,
Wow.
you end up with a death sentence. And that's essentially what happened to my dad. His cancer was all over his body, and they gave him, just a few months to live, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So that was an eye-opening experience for myself and our entire family. And I said, if after this one that I'm still like super in, my first business, because those times I was still like super busy and engaged in that business, I said, if I have the energy to do another one, I'm going to do it in healthcare and try to fix the state of healthcare.
So you knew, as far as back then, that would be where you would.
That
would
was a big passion area and big interest area. And again, I was sort of not misguided. That's totally the wrong word, but it all came through the experience that I had with my dad and the experience he had. Right. And so the company that I ended up jumping into, it was and the reason we invested initially into the business and partnered with the founders, was basically applying early days of AI, artificial intelligence, to help organize and distill all of the world's knowledge around biomarkers and their impact on disease and drugs, and sort of that whole intelligence of biomarkers. And biomarkers, for those that don't know, I'm probably getting super technical, but they're biological markers in our bodies, right? They're genes, proteins, that impact a lot of what happens to us, and have impacts on disease. And so the company was doing really innovative work in essentially analyzing, using computers, teaching computers how to analyze all of this knowledge that was embedded in written text, right? Because it's there, all this knowledge is in like, millions and millions of 100 plus page documents that someone would need to read to distill it all.
What's weird about this, like, you're a little bit ahead. I mean,
we were so ahead.
You're ahead of the curve, because now we're into the obvious one being ChatGPT,
the whole AI boom,
the whole application of language text analysis.
Talk about timing right there.
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, we're not to get too far ahead in the story, but it's like one of those things. If you had to do it again, and now you're starting with, if you started with those tools already available, what would the acceleration of the product look like? And would it look a lot different? And what were the resources necessary to do it?
So differently, right? Because we were having to build everything on our own, right? It was for the type of business that we were building, it was a very highly capital intensive business in software, right? At that time, there was very little tooling. There were some open source projects, right, that we were able to leverage, and it was advancing pretty quickly, but nowhere near the level that it's advancing over the last few years. And so it was an extremely capital intensive business. And I jump in, the company basically has like $1 in the bank account. And that's why I said it's either we're going to go at it again or we're going to shut it down, right? It was a pretty dire situation. And so I made the decision. I was so passionate that this was a company that needed to exist, that I jumped in not only with all of my time and energy, but also with a significant capital infusion into the business from my own funds, personal funds, to keep it alive, not just alive, but get us enough runway where we could actually, turn it around and get it going.
See growth and everything you need to.
Yeah. And, the founders and the team, it was a small team at that time. They were obviously tired, right? As we all are, founding teams. And so one of the first things I said to the team was, okay, I'm coming in. I believe that this company needs to exist. I know that you guys do too. You've been dedicating your lives to this business. But I need to know right now, and we need to know collectively as a team, who's in for this next second round, right? Of we're going to pain, right? And we're going to turn this around and make it happen, right? And about a third of the team kind of said, no, I can't do it. I'm not in, right? And so small team, we lose some key people as a result of me saying, but I felt like we had to do that.
Yeah, no, you did. No, it's good that you said it right up front as opposed to
learning that afterwards, right?
And then you're letting people go, and you're kind of creating this sort of tension, like, oh God, like we really valued that person. Why are they going? You kind of laid out the criteria that was necessary at this stage to have a chance of success.
That's right. We needed people that were going to be all in, right? And dedicated, even though they were tired, right? That they were into it. And so, we lost about a third of the team, and it hurt because it was such a small team that every person was critical, right? So we went into immediate, team building mode. Who do we need, right, to get this company to the next level? And it was a company that not only was super hard from a technology perspective, right? And capital intensive because we were applying like AI techniques, teaching computers, right? That's hard stuff.
Exactly.
And we were in a vertical that required a lot of domain expertise that I frankly didn't have. I had sold, horizontal solutions into pharma and healthcare, but never like fully immersed selling to like scientists.
Yeah, your buyers are the scientists.
Exactly. And they are so smart, right?
And 10 PhDs each of them, and
right. So you have to absolutely have that domain expertise, and that existed to some extent in the founder that stayed along, right? But we needed that desperately, and so I went out on recruiting mode, like aggressive recruiting mode. That was task number one. And we were able to find an amazing person to join the team. And so just really started building out the team. And long story short, we got the business turned around, built a really great team, brought in investors because it was such a capital intensive business. I wasn't willing to just do that all on my own. I needed some investment partners. And we were able to attract tier one investors to come in to the business. So it was really fun, we're like, okay, we're doing this. We survived,
I was going to say, were you having fun again? Because
there were periods of a lot of not fun.
I know. I appreciate you being honest on this stuff. Because like this is the rose colored thing. We don't want to do that. We want to say, hey, no, this is what it looked like. I think there's this scenario when you are the founder of something, like where the idea is born. Mm-hmm. I've always looked at the founders or the caretakers of the idea, and you're managing this idea versus when I came in. It's funny that we have some parallels. When I came in into this restaurant technology, it wasn't even like the healthcare, the motivation of personal health improvement wasn't there. It was another company, but I still really enjoyed it. I was like, man, we're going to solve this problem. But the technology was already in play, and I got to morph it. And it was very hard for me to imprint a vision on that.
Yeah, but you have to, right? I mean, that's key. Yeah.
And I wonder, on the largest scale, why has Jobs come back to Apple and now it works, right?
Right.
Because it's something
He's got that vision. Yeah.
Yeah. And so
vision.
How did that work for you? Incorporating your vision at that stage of the business and getting that to work. And was that fun for you, or what was the fun part? What was the challenging part? I like to ask I ask questions. Usually I ask like 4. Like, it's kind of frustrating everybody I talk with but my mind.
Where do I start there?
No,
yeah, your mind's going. Yeah,
my mind's going like, no. What about this? What about
right,
that?
right, right. Well,
So
I'll see if I can
answer
some
that
of that.
sequentially, however it makes sense to you.
Okay. Well, so vision as the CEO, right? And if that's the founder, CEO, or CEO coming in, that vision and the strategy for how we're going to get to that vision, and not just from a product strategy, but the go-to-market strategy. What are the stepping stones to getting to that vision?
Yeah.
Absolutely critical role of the CEO and the rest of the team, but really the CEO has to drive a lot of that. And so, yeah, it was hard because one of the first things that as I started really engaging with customers,
I was going to say, go to the customer.
Yeah, we went to the customers, and one of the immediate things that I realized is we were not retaining customers. We were able to get a lot of new customers, but we weren't retaining them, right? And so, okay, and that's a problem of a lot of businesses.
Yep.
And so what's at the root of that, right? And so we really got focused in understanding that. And I think what we learned is that because the target audience was so extremely brilliant and scientific, as they got into the solution, they lost trust in it whenever we had even one minor mistake, right? And they were relentless about that. And so you got to understand, we were early days AI, right? AI has been going on for a lot longer, but early days, we had a lot of mistakes. The computers were making mistakes.
For sure.
And they still do, even now, right? That's one of the big challenges with the more recent Gen AI wave. So, but because of the demographic and the client that we were targeting, they are so scientific, so risk averse, that they did not give us any room for error, right? And as soon as they saw one minute error, right, they didn't trust the whole thing. It was like, it's all bad. Right? And so that was one of the key reasons why we were suffering from retention. And so when we brought in the domain expert who reported directly to me and basically owned the product direction, she felt that we were not going to be ready to target that audience for a while. And it was going to be an ongoing problem, that we were too far, right? And so what we immediately had to do is pivot and figure out, okay, what stepping stone, still within our broader market, were we going to go be relevant to, and they were going to be a lot easier on us for some errors, because we were going to have errors. That was just the nature of the solution. And so we ended up pivoting to a sales and marketing support function, interestingly enough, and we felt that was going to be a really good stepping stone to really fine-tuning the solution and fine-tuning the data quality and the intelligence quality, to then after that be very relevant to the core scientists.
You know what's really I think transformative here, or I would say like someone could take and apply, is that it's not just, you got to know your customer and the product.
Got to talk to them too.
You got to talk to them. But this sort of receptiveness to mistakes or not, the tolerance to that. We're talking about subtleties here, right?
Yeah.
But these are subtleties that
apply across the board,
make or break businesses. Because my parallel, again, just drawing from our own experience here, my own experience relative to this, like selling into lawyers, especially like lawyers of some of the top firms in the world, like, they're not tolerating a lot of mistakes either, right? Think about like writing a document, right? They don't
it's
make
got to be perfect.
They don't make mistakes in that M&A document when they're representing you, or this litigation complaint, or they're fired. So guess what? That's going all the way down. And I'm like trying to play in my mind, like, how do you manage against that expectation? And could you have managed against that expectation in a different way? So like if you come in with a pilot, or you come in with an adoption, say, hey, you're going to see 10% errors. Don't be so hard. I mean, or would you not been able to sell it if you said it?
We would have.
Did they just expect perfection?
I think because of the nature of their roles and their personality, similar to lawyers, right? and the output that they've got,
Yeah.
you can't have mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they are the type of individuals where you see a mistake and you kind of already just discount the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
You can't take little nuggets and say,
That's it.
okay, that was valuable. I'm going to take that, but I'm going to ignore that because that I know that's wrong.
Whereas, in most innovation cycles, like even though this one's a complex one too, you kind of factor that in.
Yes.
Everybody's anticipating mistakes. It's called early adoption. It's called product
That's
evolution.
right.
That's
right.
And by the way, you're adding features all the time, so there's going to be bugs.
That's right. I mean, it's going to improve constantly.
I would say as much as our lawyers didn't like the lawyers that use our product didn't like the mistakes, the majority of people that use that product weren't the lawyers. They were the BDev marketing teams.
Yeah.
They were in our case.
Yeah.
And we roll out features.
Yeah.
They'd find some we couldn't find through our own regression analysis or our qualitative control testing, but we could fix it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And they didn't kick us out.
Right. And that's what we found, and why we pivoted to the sales and marketing teams is because they were a lot more understanding of that. It wasn't that 100% accuracy wasn't as important to them in the value prop, right?
The use case is different, though.
The use case is different, but we were still getting in the door in these companies, helping the sales and marketing teams with a very, very valuable resource. And so it was a really good pivot.
So would they get the information then, and would they be able to, lack of a better word, cherry pick what they needed to sort of bring to the PhDs or the scientists and say, hey, listen, this is something that you're going to act on? Or was their use case just a lot different than...
Their use case was purely around identifying and targeting their potential customers. So we were identifying data through the distillation that we were doing in all the literature of what companies were working on, what types of drugs, what types of biomarkers, what kind of diagnostic equipment they needed. And so these sales and marketing teams were using our data to target. Right before us, they were basically just scattershot. It's like, hey, are you working in this area? And do you need this kind of diagnostic equipment that I have? And now they're targeted with data, right? Factual data that tells them this company's working on this thing and they need your product. Go talk to them.
Okay, good.
So that was a great pivot. Really worked very well. We were knocking down great customers, really amazing names, right? That if I blurted out some of them, you would know them, right? Good logos, yeah. So good transition, and then freaking COVID hits. And in the pharmaceuticals,
once in 100-year, hopefully, less than that even, but that's sort of the cadence of these things.
Yeah, and this was at a time where we had probably about 18 to 24 months of runway. We had scaled the business up. It was going well, right? The investors were super happy. And then COVID hits. And in the pharmaceuticals industry, it became all about finding the cure for COVID. And there was so much money being thrown at the industry, literally train loads, truckloads of just money going into the industry to fix this problem. Right. Government money primarily around the world. And so their sales and marketing teams were told to just go on a paid vacation. Literally.
Really?
Yeah, because the industry just kind of shut down, right? To a large extent. It was all about COVID.
Yeah.
And that lasted for almost 2 to 3 years.
Yeah.
So a lot of people that aren't in that industry didn't really realize that was going on, right? But a lot of clinical trials, important clinical trials for cancers or diabetes kind of shut down. And there was no sort of momentum going on in those areas. And so, it went from wow, this is easy to sell, right? And customers are really digging what we have to offer, to now these sales and marketing teams are just
in 2 years.
Yeah, they're on vacation, paid vacation, right? For an extended period of time. And so that was a really, really hard period for the company. So talk about, these kind of just waves, right? Yeah. And so we had to make a tough decision of, okay, do we scale back right now that we've built up this team? Yeah. And this is like a macro thing we had no control over, just bad luck, bad timing.
Yeah.
And so we made the decision, or do we pivot, and go to how can we be helpful for COVID, right? And we tried that, but it didn't really work.
There's probably a lot of noise there too. A lot of other
Tons of
providers and
noise.
suppliers trying to be part of that equation too, especially if that's the only place where there is traction.
Yeah, tons of noise.
Okay.
And then we also had the whole dynamic of, the work from home, and now the team is, working from home, and that transition. And
when are they accessible?
Right. And are they going to Hawaii?
And do you really want to manage? I was talking to one gentleman that had a technology company here in town, and he said that one of the C-level people came to him. I can't remember CFO, CMO, but I want to say CFO. It doesn't matter, but a key C-level role.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, "Hey, I'm moving to Italy," and he's like, "It's just the weirdest thing. Like they're not. Sometimes they're on. I see them walking around, or I went to Wyoming.
Yeah,
but you still need that person.
Totally. And we had exactly that happen to us.
Wow.
In a few different areas. So that was
growth
really tough.
Slows for macro, and then you have others. Okay.
Yeah. So we had to scale back. Long story short is we had to scale back the team, and that came later than it should have, because we had no idea how long this COVID thing was going to last. And last thing we want to do is cut back on the team when we're rocking and rolling, and this COVID thing hopefully ends in 3 months or 6 months, right? But we all know how that played out. It was a multi-year sort of like, craziness. So that was tough to manage through. But we did, and we made the necessary cuts at late, right? Yeah. So our runway is now shorter. Fundraising dried up, right? And as a result of COVID, right, investors got really scared, right? Yeah. And so fundraising dried up. And the long story short is that we were in a situation where if we were going to continue with the business, we would have had to take it down to such a low level again. Yeah. Right. And then start up again. Yeah. That we made the decision to actively find a buyer for the business. Yeah. And so I dedicated probably the last 8 months of my time as a CEO there to doing exactly that, is finding a strategic buyer for the business. We had invested over $7 million in the technology. It was all very cool stuff. AI. We built a lot of our own tooling. Yeah. So there was a lot of value in the company and the tech and the customers that we still had, right? And we didn't lose any customers through that process. It was just a hard thing to continue to grow at the level we were. Sense, yeah. So long story short, we found a great home for the business. They did not want me in that case. They had a leader that wanted to take on that business and was seeing it as a stepping stone in their career at the business. And so I provided advisory support and contracted with them for about, it was supposed to be 6 months. It lasted about a year. But I stopped being the active operating CEO or leader of the business. Yeah. So anyways, probably a lot more info than you wanted to hear.
No, that was life after the exit. There's a couple chapters there. And I'm glad that you're able to sit down with me again, because I feel like we only really did get half of the story in our first chapter, which is probably one of the more exciting parts. And everybody loves that aspect of it. But then there's the second thing, and then there's another transition into being an entrepreneur, and you don't turn that off. And you and I have been sitting down now here for a while.
Well, and how luck and timing, right, is such a key part of the ingredient, right? Yeah, the ingredients.
I mean, that timing in particular, like the COVID, like that's a challenge for even in a business that's well established and existing, let alone an early stage, kind of a startup thing. So, okay, so that, there's still time for Chris Capdevila, 3.0 when that comes. And I know you're thinking about that, but it also kind of creates a criteria list. And I don't need it today, but this is just something we'll talk offline about one of these times. But, what's next and what I need to see work in that equation now that I've lived through a couple different cycles of being an entrepreneur, different parts of my life too. Stages of my life.
Stages of my life for sure.
And there's so much that you learn from each of those to help you set up what it is you want to do next, whether that's more of a full-time investor or advisory sort of work, or however wherever you see yourself going. But I like when you kind of connect dots in this journey of like what was common in all these things, right? There was passion around the idea, right? A void that needed to be filled, you get help, the application of product and kind of pivoting. And those are what you enjoyed, right? Obviously, we always enjoy the exit, and we want a bigger exit for anything we do. And we don't want a freaking huge macro event.
No,
But-
it's the creation process, right? You're creating
But like you're
something,
saying, the timing, man, because
Mm-hmm.
my second one that went down, it was right as the 2002 cycle hit. And, we got, HP was an investor and it was salvaged and the product continued on, but I felt like, man, that macro environment just derailed me because I couldn't raise the funds that I needed without a really significant, devaluation of the company, which is what happened from 2020 through 2022 to a lot of the tech companies that are in that cycle. So you either do what you did or you take a pretty big down
or shut it down.
Yeah, or shut it down, and that seems like a bad result. I mean,
Bad result.
All that investment.
So much investment and time and energy that went
good
into
technology.
it. And a business that needs to exist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, nice work finding a place for that. And, well, like we said, we'll get you back. And when we talk 3.0.
Round 3.
Well, we got other things that we need to cover, like, ingredients of a successful company that I'd kind of thrown out earlier, but this is so much to cover today that I think it's a good place to, let us get on with the rest of our days. Thanks for your time, my friend.
Yeah. Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right, everybody. Until next time, appreciate your time. Onward.
I'm wandering down the road 4 and I said I've been walking for about 1,000 years, and my feet are growing tired, my eyes a little wide, don't know what to do unless I retire. And he just said, just play some crazy poker. So I said, Johnny, what you doing?